what it all boils down to is mindset. Obviously, there's certain things that are going to be really difficult and painful, but most of the things that we put fear and anxiety into, they're not inherently good or bad. It's how we perceive those things in our life. So you can perceive them as being bad, and they will be bad, or you can choose to perceive those events as being educational, transformational, and you can choose to have that mindset. And so that's how I'm playing the game.
Welcome to Life is the Game, hosted by yours truly, Alexandra Nicole Stone. Get ready to uncover the secrets to mastering your destiny, becoming the main character in your life, and embracing a life filled with meaning and joy. Awesome. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Life is the Game. I'm your host, Alexandra Nicole Stone, and I'm really excited to have Adam Baruh here with us today, who's a dear friend of mine. Adam is the CEO of a professional service consulting agency based in Carlsbad, California. Over the last 3 years, he spent a considerable amount of time looking within and trying to identify the type of leader he wanted to be. He's felt imposter syndrome trying to fit in the mold of a CEO with his background as a software developer and photographer. It wasn't until he started practicing mindfulness and listening to his higher self that he started to realize that his calling as a leader is to practice leading with empathy. He's previously hosted a podcast called The Change, focusing on stories and inspiration from business leaders and individuals making a positive work or life change for themselves or their teams that they lead. He's currently the host of Beyond the Microphone, a podcast about podcasters and the stories behind how their shows came together, launched, grew, and the lessons they learned along the way. Thanks so much for joining me, Adam.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, I know we briefly mentioned in your bio kind of a little bit about your history, but I really want to know more about your journey. How did you get into IT? How did that kind of lead into you becoming a CEO? And how does photography fit into the mix as well?
Yeah, there was never really much of a grand plan. I mean, I think it's more doing something and then, getting really interested in something. And there's been times where I've done pivots and stuff like that. But my degree in college is in physical geography, which I went to San Francisco State. That was kind of like their environmental studies program. And at the time I was in school, I was working as a biological technician for the National Park Service. And I loved that job. Definitely thought that was the direction I was going to go. And in fact, I was working on my master's degree and I decided to do my master's thesis on ecotourism. And it just so happened that my neighbors owned a house. They had built this house in Costa Rica and they were looking for somebody to live there for about a year, at which time then they would move back. And so they asked me, hey, is that something you might want to do? Come live in our house and hang out in Costa Rica. And, like, oh, well, that sounds pretty amazing. Yeah, I could do my thesis on ecotourism. What a great place to talk about ecotourism in Costa Rica. And, at the end of the year, I'll come back. I'll get this job in the park system or in the environmental field somewhere. And there was probably, I think, a 6-month period of time to plan everything before I was actually going to go to Costa Rica. And what happened was my wife at the time, got pregnant. We still decided to go to Costa Rica and have the baby there because our friends, they had their baby there and they, knew the midwives really well. And they said it's completely safe. There's a hospital not too far away. We wanted to do a home birth anyway. So went down there, and indeed, my daughter, who's now almost 25, was born in Playa Chiquita, Costa Rica. But I didn't do a single thing towards my master's thesis. I don't think I spent 1 minute on anything school related while I was down there. I mean, I had a young baby, but I was also spending my days at the beach and playing volleyball and having fun. So to kind of answer your question at the beginning, like how that led into the CEO thing. I mean, that didn't come till years later, but now having a kid, in Costa Rica. And then when our time ended there, my ex-wife and I decided to move. Instead of back home to San Francisco, we decided to move to Santa Barbara. And now I had a kid, so I had to get a job, and support this family. I had, even through when I was working for the Park Service, I was doing a lot of ArcView, like GIS mapping and stuff like that, and database work. And so I had some technical skills. And so that kind of like the job that I got moving to Santa Barbara was in the technical field. And that's probably ultimately what started the whole journey to where I'm at today. And so I've done various things, technical support, software development. I did get into wedding photography in about 2008, really quickly. Like, a friend was getting married down here, and he didn't have a lot of budget for hiring a professional wedding photographer. I had never even talked photography with this guy before. I don't think I didn't have a good camera. I was interested in photography, but I was a good friend of his, and I think he just, he didn't care quality wise, just as long as he can get, some decent photos out of the day. And so he asked me to do it. And I wanted to do a really good job for him. So I actually bought a nice camera. I researched and educated myself to do a good job. Ended up shooting his wedding and turning that into a 10-year career as a wedding photographer. I shot probably over 200 weddings all over the world, the highlight of which was going to shoot a wedding in Italy, in the same castle in Tuscany where I got married to my current wife. And so we got to go back, because my current wife also was a wedding photographer. So we got to go back, and I think one of the last weddings that we shot was to go back to Italy about 2 years after we got married, revisit the same castle, meet up with the same people and do it again. So, but financially, it's really, really difficult to make it, even though we were so busy. There's just such little margin in that world. And it kind of financially ruined me, to be honest. I mean, I did end up declaring a bankruptcy in 2013, namely, because I wasn't, I kind of dug myself into a hole, not generating the income needed. I think people that don't have like kids and at the time child support and all that, perhaps it's financially more doable, but didn't work out for me financially. I ended up leaving that, getting back into the NetSuite world, and fast forward to here I am today. I'm the CEO of a NetSuite professional services and reseller company. We've been in business for 7 years, and it's one of 3 businesses that I operate, but pretty much my full-time gig.
That's a pretty wild journey. I have to stop and acknowledge that. So, from Costa Rica to owning your own business, do you ever feel that you kind of maybe miss where your roots started out, where in the beginning you're doing a lot of the ecological work, you're focusing mostly in that industry, and obviously things change. But as you've kind of gone on this journey, do you ever feel that you want to return to that or that you miss that? Does that ever come up for you?
I think in the past it might have a few times. I know that there was a period of time after my second child was born where I wanted to like leave software per se and maybe explore if there were GIS jobs. For whatever reason, I just didn't pursue that. But, like, why did I get into that environmental studies program? It's because I loved hiking. I loved nature. I loved conservation, preservation, and trying to make a difference in this natural world in which we live. And I still live that way. I thoroughly enjoy hiking. And in fact, I'm in the process right now of moving from San Diego up to Santa Cruz to be closer to the redwoods and kind of
Yes.
to what I think is some of the best hiking in the world. So that's still, it's not my job. Like, it doesn't have to be my job to provide that connection to nature
Yeah.
for me. So I really enjoy doing what I do as an entrepreneur because it's very creative. There's a lot of problem solving, lots of great relationships I've made over the years. And so, do I wish at times that I would be doing something different? I'd like to spend more time doing the podcasting work that I do and running my podcast software company, but I just got this big project in my NetSuite business and it's really exciting. And so I'm kind of really, reinvested into this client that we took on and my team and making this thing be what I've, for the last 7 years really worked hard to create. So.
Yep. Well, let's get into that because one of my favorite things and kind of the reason I've started this podcast is like my sort of obsession with the journey we go on as these, characters when we're playing out of our lives. And I think Costa Rica might have been like a side quest for you. That's kind of how I look at it. And so kind of how have all these sort of cumulative side quests and journeys you've been on led to kind of where you are today and kind of how is that fulfilling you? And how have those things played a role in your life where maybe if you didn't do them, you wouldn't be able to kind of do these other things, such as I know you have a podcast company as well.
No, that's a great question, and that's been a journey for me as well. I've definitely I've had it through my career. I've just done things, and I've had these jobs. I do think everything is related. Like when I was doing wedding photography, even though it's completely unrelated to running a software consulting agency, when you look at it at the surface level, just being an entrepreneur, running a business as a wedding photographer, 100% enabled me to run this company. I mean, there's a lot that I learned then that is translating into what I'm doing today. One of the things actually I bring up almost weekly. So when I was doing wedding photography, and I was, like I said, I was doing it with my now current wife, we went through a period of time where, in our early relationship, we wanted to like create a business together. I was doing wedding photography before I met her. She was doing it out in Boston before she met me. So now we come together and we were trying to like build a business together. And so we actually hired a branding company to come in and work with us to build this wedding photography studio, if you will. And that was a really cool experience because it was vastly different from what I expected. We started our rebrand by being given a book called StrengthsFinder 2.0, which at the end has this little code, and you go online and you take like a 30-minute self-assessment exam. And we then took the results and sent them to Krista, who was our point of contact at this branding company. And then she reviewed the results, and we went from there. And so I was like, well, why are we doing this exercise? Like, how's it going to go into our brand, right? What I learned in wedding photography was that truly our brand was us, myself and Shauna, my wife. And so that's what the exercise was all about. But I learned something really valuable in that experience, which was, the whole point of that StrengthsFinder 2.0 test is to identify you as an individual, your top 5 strengths. We spend so much time like looking at our weaknesses, what we're not good at, trying to get better at those. It's, whereas maybe let's take that same energy and focus on our top 5 strengths and put all of our energy in accentuating our strengths. And so when I took the test, some of my strengths were like development, maximizer, like these like real kind of like go-getter, task driven. I don't need to do a lot of research. I can just take a set of requirements and just go. Whereas my wife, what we learned is like her strengths are like intellect and researching. She likes to gather a bunch of information before she makes a decision, which is like counter to me.
Yeah.
And so when we were in business together, like doing this wedding photography studio, often she would kind of drive me nuts because like I'd be like just banging on the keyboard, doing things, like getting stuff done. And she all day long would be like, hey, what if we did this? What, like just all these ideas. It would drive me nuts, to be honest. But having gone through that exercise, now I'm like, oh, I'm like now a little bit better able to put myself in Shauna's shoes. What drives Shauna? How does she work? What makes her tick? Now I can put words to like understanding like why she all day long was, peppering me with her ideas. And the fact that now she knows who she is, she knows who I am. Not that I want to stifle those ideas, but for me, in what I need, like what came out of that was like, hey, jot down your ideas all day long. Let's have a 3 o'clock meeting every day where we can just talk about your ideas. And then it's not like all day long, kind of this, interruption. And so out of that whole thing is empathy building, emotional intelligence, the ability to like figure out what somebody else's strengths are and what makes them tick, and team building, right? And so as a CEO now running a consulting agency, guess how I use team building now? I actually still go back to that Strengths Finder 2.0 book. I give copies of it to everybody. Everybody takes the test. We haven't done this in a while, but we used to meet and talk about so-and-so's strengths are this person's strengths are here. How can we understand each other's strengths and learn how to work together better? And so really going back to your original question, like I think everything is connected. Everything is led up to what I'm doing today. Nothing has been in a void, And one other thing I'll say is we have a mutual friend, Paul Berry, and
Yes.
I'm always really fascinated in conversations that I have with Paul. In fact, now remembering that I do need to reach out to him because we're supposed to go on a hike. But in one of my last conversations with Paul, he introduced me to this Japanese concept of Ikigai, and I'm probably botching it. But I think the overall idea is this idea that you have you and your core values and desires and drives that are at the center. And that's what really feeds our spirit and our soul and makes everything feel good and everything tick. And I would tell Paul, like, numerous times, I'm like, God, this consulting agency that I run, it feels like an anchor. It just like an energy vampire. It sucks so much of my attention. It doesn't fill my cup, but the podcasting work fills my cup. And Paul was the first person to say, what if you looked at it differently? What if you looked at your company as it's providing something that, while it doesn't directly fill that center of this Ikigai principle, that center, which is you and your main hopes and desires, it's allowing you, because one thing it's doing is financially giving you the capability to also be doing this podcasting work, which is closer to what fills your cup.
Yeah.
So rather than having this conflict with this part of my time that I have to invest, looking at it differently, where instead now I look at it as actually one of the supporting blocks that enables me to do the things that fill my cup.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how you game the system, right? That's how you gamify your life. It's all about your mindset.
Yeah. I that is a classic Paul Berry sort of line, right? It's like, okay, where am I now and how do I make my reality as close as to my dream as possible? I want to also just like touch up on something that we kind of brushed over quickly. Did you meet your wife before your current wife before you started the photography business? Is that something that you decided to start together?
So I was doing wedding photography while I was still married to my ex-wife.
Okay.
And just to put a time perspective on there, this was like 2008, 2009-ish. So if you remember back then, that was like this big recession that we were having, right?
Yeah.
And so I was actually like, my regular work was getting diminished, as many people's were, right? And photography came in like at a beautiful time because it now gave me a creative outlet, this whole new thing that was like doing something for myself that filled my cup, connected me with people like at a very intimate time and emotional time in their own lives. And I need that human connection, which I didn't feel I was having. And, my ex and I were kind of like, that's when kind of the idea to split up actually was around that time. So the photography was kind of an outlet for me to cope with what I was going through. And it's really ironic that, wedding photography was my outlet in dealing with my own marriage falling apart,
Yeah.
right? But it was. And I definitely saw the irony at the time in it. But I would say I probably did photography for 3.5 years or so before I even met my current wife, which we met on Match.com. And I think the initial reason why we even contacted each other or responded to each other was we had this common thing in both being wedding photographers. She had just moved to San Diego from Cape Cod, where I think for 2 years before that, she was doing wedding photography on her own. She's got a degree in photography. And then so we came together, we started dating, and it wasn't until actually later on that I was like, "Hey, do you want to come second shoot this wedding for me? And let's work together a little bit and see how that goes, and maybe we build our own studio." So it manifested later.
That's really cool. I really wanted you to share that story because I know, love is a hard thing for a lot of people to find, and especially like young people nowadays. And it's kind of like, okay, you took this sort of leap of faith onto photography that was a hobby or for your friend, and then it became kind of this outlet for you, right? And then, the beautiful thing in that is that you ultimately met your new partner in this sort of serendipitous way. That's sort of those things where when you break that pattern where you're always doing something the same way, you never know what's going to come out on the other side. Like how could you have ever expected that? But if you never just said, "Well, you know what, like I'm going to take the time and do a really good job on my friend's wedding shoot," like how that might have never ever happened. So I really wanted to highlight that because I think there's something quite beautiful there.
Yeah, I talk about leaps of faith quite a bit with just people in general, but like certainly on my podcast, it's been a theme time and time again. Leading up to that moment in time when I started to get into wedding photography, I felt very stuck in my life. I was unhappy in my marriage. I was unhappy in my job. I felt very stuck. I had young kids, so I didn't really have much time to do things that filled my cup. And I think I was living somewhat of a fear-based life. I really was kind of insulated. I hadn't really done much traveling other than moving to Costa Rica. That certainly was quite a journey, especially having a kid down there. So it wasn't I was like devoid to it, but I certainly lived a life of fear and hadn't really challenged myself and put myself out there. Wedding photography was my first true leap of faith, an individual leap of faith. If I hadn't taken that leap of faith, I can tell you I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be running this company. It opened up everything for me. And I've taken so many leaps of faith now in my life. Every single one of those was at times frightening. I would leave in the early days of wedding photography, I would leave a wedding crying in my car, thinking I just completely ruined that person's wedding. And then I'd edit the pictures and be like, wasn't that actually? It was pretty good. But it's really hard. It's very vulnerable to take a leap of faith and do something totally different that maybe. And for me, again, not being somebody who needs a tremendous amount of research, although I did do as much as I can to educate myself as a photographer, I didn't know what I was doing. And it was very scary. And so what did I learn that first time? I learned the capacity for getting outside of my comfort zone. And so that was something that I realized about myself that I actually never knew before. And so I've taken so many leaps of faith now. Every single one of those I've failed, I've stumbled, I've had great success and triumph and connection. And it's all been meaningful. It's all taught me the lessons. I've been over time, like opening up my mindset to be receptive of the lessons. And that's how I've gone about gamifying this thing we call life.
Yeah. I think taking risks is something that we've become so averse to in, you know, our current reality, especially now, like so much uncertainty, so much this, so much that, so many options, right? We have sort of developed this aversion to taking risks that, oh my gosh, it's terrifying. But I think, some of the best parts about playing games, right, is like, oh, hey man, like I'm gonna jump off this cliff and hope I make it to the other side because there might be something cool waiting for me there. Obviously, we have like a certain degree of self-preservation in life, but it's no game would be fun if we're just like, okay, we're just gonna play it safe the whole time. And then
Yeah.
hopefully we'll get to the end of the plot. And then by the time we meet the final boss, right, we've done nothing to challenge ourselves or prepare ourselves for that moment. So kind of taking those risks is at what adds flavor, what adds those shades of color to our lives and what allows us to build character. Like you said, like you wouldn't have never done those things. Or I could totally relate to doing something and be like, oh, I thought that was terrible. Right. And then
Totally.
surprising
Yeah.
yourself. And every single time you do something, doesn't have to be a major thing like moving to Costa Rica, but like those micro risks, it encourages you and it makes you stronger. So
Totally.
I think people need to sort of like shift that mentality a little bit and be like, what's a little risk I can take today to sort of bolster me up, right?
Yeah.
And just have more fun, right? Nothing has to be so serious. We make things very serious in our mind.
Totally do. Yeah, 100%. I think we all overanalyze things and take things too seriously. I mean, I still do it today. That's probably a constant work in progress for all of us,
Yes.
is to really just be a little bit softer on ourselves and a
Yes.
little bit lighter.
Someone
Question.
else, how you would you treat someone else, how you're treating yourself, and the answer most likely is going to be like no.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was going to ask, would you say that the photography experience was your turning point, maybe like your aha moment where you realized, okay, maybe everything is not so fixed. Maybe I have free will. Like maybe I can make more decisions or take more risks and have a little bit more choices in my life. Because I remember you were saying, okay, at that time you felt really stressed. Obviously, having a family, having the responsibility of children, going through divorce, like all those things sort of kind of put a burden on you and shrink your field of vision and your reality, right? So would you say kind of having that experience and maybe meeting your new wife and all those things is what kind of was that aha moment where you're like, hang on, maybe I am looking at things the wrong way?
It was an aha moment, but very profound for me at the time. You know, when the idea first came to get divorced, it's shattering. I mean, for anybody that's ever dealt with it, and I think whatever side you're on of it, if you're the one wanting to get divorced or you're on the receiving end of, somebody telling you they want to get divorced, it's still shattering and devastating, to go through that. And I was taken down to such a low level. And there were times that I had no optimism left. I didn't know. I mean, first of all, I had been with her for so long, since my early 20s, that I didn't really have a definition of myself or an identity of myself. And plus, I had kids at a young age, so I hadn't really experienced these things that like developed like a really strong sense of identity. Well, wedding photography is what was my first aha moment. And there was a specific moment where I was like, gosh, like I have so much ahead of me. Like it filled so much optimism and human connection with people, just these beautiful moments that I got to be a part of and witness. And so it was an aha moment, but I've had very significant aha moments since then. The most profound of which was in April of 2021, when I started working with my coach, who is another mutual friend, Kristen Taylor. That was the up till my birthday was yesterday. I turned 51.
Oh,
So
happy
in my
birthday.
51, thank you. So in all of my 51 years, and there's still many more years to come, but that up till now with Kristen and a revelation I had was the aha moment in my life, which really opened the door to so much growth, the most growth I've ever experienced.
Well, do you want to share a little bit about that? Kind of how that impacted your life and maybe what that was, what realizations you were able to have through that
Yeah,
process?
certainly. And this isn't the first time I've shared this story. This isn't a story unique to me. I think so many people go through something like this, but not everybody really um, has that aha moment to really grow from what they experience. But in late 2019, early 2020, I mean, before the pandemic kicked in, out of nowhere, I started getting these anxiety attacks.
Mm.
I had had one panic attack in my life, which was having to fly home from New York City right after 9/11. Like, I was in New York City for 2.5 weeks right after 9/11 and dealing with that. And then the day I went to fly home, it hit me on the airplane, this claustrophobic anxiety attack. So that was the only one I ever had. And then probably, I don't know, 20 so years passed before I had my next one. And so I started getting these like almost nightly, as I'm trying to go to sleep. Looking back now, I had a brand new baby who was born at the end of 2019, my fourth kid. So I'm sleeping about 3 hours a night, and it's not even a consecutive 3 hours. I'm running this company, so I'm working about 70 to 80 hours a week. Very little sleep, very high stress. And so bam, these anxiety attacks happen. So they were so debilitating and devastating for me. And it took, I really didn't know. I mean, I think I was dealing with them for like a solid year and a half before I finally realized I need help. I can't get out of this situation I'm in on my own. I actually need to go get help. And it just so happened that I got this solicitation on LinkedIn just for somebody who was advertising themselves as an executive coach. Kristen Taylor, executive coach, right? So I get daily, I get numerous solicitations for coaches. I mean, that's just part of being on LinkedIn and being in somebody in my role. I ignore 100% of those, but at this time I knew I needed help. I get this solicitation. I was like, maybe that's what I need. Let's check that out. So I responded, and Kristen and I started working together. And it was actually our second session. And I remember specifically, I was talking with Kristen about what I described as a lot of guilt that I still was carrying from the divorce because of the impact that it had on my two older children, specifically my son, who is almost 22 now, but he was a little guy at this time that I got divorced from his mom. And then just over the years since, I mean, I could see how it impacted him. And so I'm talking to Kristen about harboring, what I described as all this guilt that I still felt around that. And Kristen asked me the question, which was the question that changed everything in my life, which was, Adam, do you think you feel guilt over that, or do you feel shame? And I didn't know the answer. I'd never really thought about guilt and shame. And so I asked Kristen, to describe guilt and shame and what the difference was, and paraphrasing her, but something to the effect of, shame is like identity impacting. Like if you feel shameful about something, like that's a belief system that can be central to your identity, right? So we wrapped up that conversation, and this was like a Friday, and I remember I went home, hung out with my family, had, again, I had two young kids now at this time also. So did the whole thing with them, got them to bed. My wife went to bed, and Friday was usually like a night that I would like watch a couple shows. So I finished watching this show. It's midnight. It's quiet in my house. Everybody's asleep. And I turn off the TV. And as soon as I turned off the TV, I'd kind of like that earlier conversation with Kristen came back into my mind. And I'm like, guilt and shame. Like, is there something in my life that I feel shameful for? I didn't say that out loud, but I voiced those words in my head. And it was exactly like immediately when I voiced that thought that I remembered back to when I was 6 years old, and my parents had gotten recently divorced. And so my mom, as a single mom, she had this babysitter, teenage boy, come over to babysit for myself. And so she can go out. And as soon as my mom would leave, this kid would lock me in my mom's walk-in closet. The lights were controlled from the outside of the closet. He'd barricade the door and turn off the lights, invite his friends over, and they'd have these big parties, be doing heroin and stuff like that. I remember seeing, like, finally, when I would get freed from the closet, seeing, people passed out with rubber hoses around their arms and needles and stuff like that, right? So, I mean, just from that experience alone, like, numerous times being locked in for hours in a pitch black dark closet and remembering this feeling of terror of being in there. And wait a second, now at the time, I'm 45, 46, having claustrophobic panic attacks. So connected there, which I never put two and two together. Never.
Yeah.
The worst part of it, though, is that I don't know if this happened once or twice. I honestly can't exactly remember. I do think maybe it was once, but as I was getting let out of that closet, is getting molested by this boy and his friends. And I never blacked that out. Never really talked about it. I mean, this was like the mid 70s, late 70s. And so there wasn't really, it wasn't really a time to like talk about that stuff. My parents, I think they knew something had happened. I don't know if they knew the extent of what happened, but it was never spoken about. And then I never spoke about it for the rest
Yeah.
of my life. I always remembered that it happened, but I thought it had no bearing in my life. I honestly thought it had no artifact in who I was or anything about me. And going back to this now kind of revelation question around guilt and shame, I'm like, oh, shit. I think I've actually built an identity system and a belief that was my fault. Like I think I my whole life thought I perpetuated that, invited it, and it was my fault and something was wrong with me. And so almost immediately in this Friday night after this conversation with Kristen and like having a moment where I'm like, that wasn't my fault. I was a victim. I was 6 years old. I had no knowledge about sex or any of that stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have even known anything about anything. Like, I was a victim. And just that revelation alone has fundamentally changed from that moment in time for all time now going forward. Like, it's really opened up the door to the most growth I've ever experienced.
Wow. Adam, first of all, I'd like to thank you for sharing that. I know I'm sorry you had to go through that. And I think something that's really, really important, and when you're on the top of the world, like you have so many responsibilities when you're a CEO, when you're a parent, when you have to be this strong figure, right? It's not okay for you to ask for help. And even if we like pull it back to the gaming trope, right? Like even the most powerful protagonist, like he needs allies to win the game. And realizing that it is okay to ask for help and like seeking that out and getting allyship from people and talking about it. That is like an essential part of succeeding in life, right? And opening up to those conversations. I really do want to give you kudos for acknowledging that, maybe there's something wrong. And I've known that in my personal life too. It has been the hardest thing to ask for help. And something like that can just unlock the box for you.
That's so key, like so fun. That is such the perfect point to all this is I never thought I was worthy of help. I had such, a negative self-esteem and negative self-talk that I had convinced myself that I was not even worthy of help. But even more than that, when something like that happens so early in your childhood, like
Yeah.
again, going to the point where I never thought there was anything left over from that moment in time until I realized that everything, like
Yeah.
it was like the driving force in everything in my life. Like, and really seeing how all these events and experiences and relationships that I've had that have fallen apart, like drug use and stuff like that, alcoholism, like
Yeah.
it's all traced back to that. And I never really realized, how much was built up in me until this revelation.
Yeah.
And, the work that I've done over time is really, looking at my strengths and looking at all the great attributes that I have and getting to the point where I wholeheartedly know that I'm not in this alone,
Yeah.
that I do need help. I mean, the reaching out to Kristen, I think, was step one in identifying that I'm worthy of getting help and I need to, my love for myself is such that I have to give that gift to myself
Yeah.
to get on the path of solid mental health and confidence and believing and loving myself.
Yeah. Sometimes life doesn't feel like a game. You're like, this is not a game I want to play. Where's the off switch, right? And we don't have the luxury of turning the off switch on. So we have to reevaluate the situation and kind of create a game plan for ourselves. So I'm happy you kind of got to process it in such a positive way. I don't know if you said it explicitly, but I think this has sort of impacted a lot of this like empathetic, like the rest of your empathy work in both leadership and sort of your original podcast that you were doing before your current one. I think that was the change,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So share a little bit about, that and how kind of your revelations and like looking at life with this sort of new perspective has allowed you to create this your current life and also setting the goals for the future, right? How has that, let the light shine on the future of what you're entering as well?
Yeah. So, something that I had dealt with because I had been running this company now for, I think at that time, up to like 5 years. And you mentioned in your intro about the imposter syndrome that I had dealt with. And
Yeah.
because I was always in conflict with myself, I didn't really believe in myself and always felt like I was fronting and that I was an imposter because I didn't know what it meant to be a CEO. Yes, I was a wedding photographer. I have a degree in natural geography. I've been a software developer, but I never really had a role as a CEO. And I thought that people expected me to be a certain way. And it was something that I was in conflict with a lot, and it made me feel terrible. And it would further erode my confidence just on a day by day basis. Anytime I'd have to get on a call, I just walked away from a call feeling like I was a fraud.
Yeah.
So in my work with Kristen, after this revelation, and we talked about, well, what do you want to do now? Like, what do you want to do with this information? Very early on, I said, I strongly wanted, because also the pandemic came in the midst of all this, right? And so all of us had this like really traumatic, mental health experience, like just dealing with the whole pandemic. And just, with what I dealt with the anxiety attacks and the trauma and nervous system stuff, I said, I really, really want to use my platform as a business leader to talk about
Mhm.
mental health, to try to destigmatize conversations around mental health, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to show that you can be a CEO and business leader and be authentic and advocate for the mental health and work-life balance of your team, not being so productivity driven, but being relationship driven. At the same time, I was just like, seeing on LinkedIn, especially like a lot of messaging from like people like Gary Vee and
Yeah.
people who would talk about like team building and like team first and empathy and using a lot of the same words that I've been using here today. And that's when it occurred to me, like, I'm fascinated and really, just intrigued by this concept of emotional intelligence, how it relates in business, trying to, normalize the mental health conversation, but also like, if I could make a change, I mean, it all started with this great resignation that happened during the pandemic. But if I can be part of this wave of being a CEO that demonstrates this team first, emotionally intelligent driven company culture where you're not, you know, profits first,
Yeah.
but, you know, team and relationships first. And if you do that right, the profits will follow. If I can demonstrate all that, then that's who I want to be as a CEO. So like my identity as a business leader really was formed by, you know, that revelation that I had, the work that I did with Kristen and really wanting to make an impact. So, I decided to also start a podcast. I just created a podcast production company. I convinced Kristen to start a podcast. And to this day, we still produce her podcast, which is called How I Made It Through. And I, produce other podcasts. In fact, my podcast production company is called EIQ Media Group. EIQ, standing for emotional IQ. And, really with the hope of curating a lot of content around these sorts of vulnerable, authentic, and important conversations to try to make an impact in people's lives, even if it's just one person or many.
Yeah. It's kind of you figured out how to sort of play the game of life on your terms, right? You have the circumstances, right? And you're like, okay, with the power that I have, with the life that I'm living, how can I make the most positive impact? How can I align it most with my values and kind of just have the most meaningful and joyful life possible in this current situation? And Adam is also helping me with my podcast too. So shout out and thank you very much, Adam. Can't let that slide
Mhm.
without an honorable mention. I think we're going to wrap it up, but I really want to ask you, to you personally, what does it mean to live life like a game? And how does this impact your perspective and your view of the long term?
So, first of all, I think, many of us think of games as having like an end, like a winner or a loser, and you get to the end of the game and that's that. I think this game that we play called life is obviously never ending. Even when we pass on, like the work that we do here hopefully is being carried forward by those that you've touched and impacted in your own time, right? Kind of where I've come to now, and the great lessons, being in my early 50s, is to try to have more fun and curiosity in life. We're all going to deal with like shit storms all the time. They're never going to go away. But what can change there is our mindset and what we do when the shit storms come up. And it's natural to get defensive and reactive, but to try to pull yourself back and remind yourself like, well, what's happening right now? Like, why is this happening? And what is it meant to teach me?
Yeah.
What's my lesson here? Because any challenging experience that we have is meant to be a lesson. I believe in spirit and higher self. And I believe that our spirit and our soul chose this life and this human experience because there's a lesson and a problem in this particular human experience that we're meant to solve. When things keep coming up in your life, the reason why they're looping like that is because you haven't solved the problem yet. For me, it's mindset. I'm working on it. I'm closer to being able to like control it and not be reactive when challenges come up, but learn the lesson, stay positive, stay joyful and curious, and hopefully have a positive impact for those around me. And what it all boils down to is mindset. Like there really isn't, obviously there's certain things that are going to be really difficult and painful, but most of the things that we put fear and anxiety into, there isn't really they're not inherently good or bad. It's how we perceive those things in
Yeah.
our life, right? So you can perceive them as being bad and they will be bad, or you can choose to perceive those events as being educational, transformational, and you can choose to have that mindset. And so that's how I'm playing the game. And that's how I feel like I'm getting ahead of the game now at this point in my life.
I love that. It's beautiful. We are just having this beautiful human experience, right? And
Hmm.
we have to move forward and we have to remember to have fun because in a minute it could be over. So I love that. Those are
Yeah.
some perfect closing remarks. Adam, thank you so much for your time and your story and your vulnerability. I really appreciate it. It's
Well,
been a
thank you so much.
fantastic
I mean, I
session.
really appreciate, you having me on here today. I love the idea of this podcast and looking at life this way as a game, because it truly is, if you want to look at it that way. So thanks, Alex.
My pleasure. And for those of you, Adam has a company podcast in addition to EIQ Media. It is a hosting and CRM for podcasts. It's sure as hell made my life a lot easier getting this thing started. So I'll drop it in the show notes. Check it out. Check out Adam and some of the other work he's doing. Great guy. And yeah, thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to Life is the Game. This is your host, Alexandra Nicole Stone, and I appreciate you coming on this journey with me. In this episode, Adam shared the countless side quests he had to undergo by overcoming imposter syndrome and trauma and embracing the transformative power of mindfulness. Adam has been able to carve the path to an authentic and empathetic leadership style and play the game of life on his terms. If you found the stories shared during this podcast valuable, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to share. Remember, you are the main character in your life. It's exciting. So, my beautiful players, next time you have a decision to make, no matter how big or small, stop and ask yourself, what would I do if my life was a game? Ready? Let's play.